Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for July 8th of 2023, and currently we have a slight risk setup that spans a very large area, expands all the way into the Memphis region of western Tennessee, into northern Mississippi, across Arkansas, northern Texas, and southern Oklahoma, into parts of New Mexico and eastern Colorado, and parts of southern Wyoming, and then a marginal threat that does span into parts of southern Montana, all the way across northern Texas into parts of eastern Alabama, across the majority of western Tennessee, and up through Kentucky into the majority of Ohio, that circles back around through southern Indiana and across parts of southern Missouri and parts of western Kansas and parts of western Nebraska. So we have a pretty large area to cover today, and it is a little bit more of a complicated day for forecasting. But as for our threats for today, we have a 2% tornado threat for the region of the western part of that slight risk region there, for the majority of eastern Colorado and parts of New Mexico, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and a little part of the northern Texas Panhandle, and parts of southeastern Wyoming, as well as a 15% wind threat on a 5% wind threat. And as for a hail threat, we have a 15% with the hatch significant for majority of a very isolated area of parts of eastern Colorado, as well as a 5% that spans up across the marginal threat. This is mostly going to be isolated back towards the western part of the slight risk region and marginal threat region. And because of our threats today, we are likely going to see more of a threat for damaging winds and large hail than really all that much of a tornado threat, but we can't rule out the possibility of one or two tornadoes that could be possible today. Taking a look at our pivotal weather models, starting off with our 500 millibars like we usually do, you can see that we do have like tons of blue pretty much everywhere across the United States. And we can see that we do have a low pressure system that's situated somewhere in Canada here. It's a very deep low pressure system, and with ejection coming across Michigan, it should eject a little bit across Indiana and Ohio, as well as with combination from the jet stream, it could possibly help with severe weather development towards the eastern part of the United States. The regions where we could see focused severe weather development is right in here and right in here, with the jet stream that is going to be triggering pretty much most of it. So that's going to be our main regions for severe weather development, and this jet stream is pretty large and pretty broad and very widespread. So again, it's going to be most likely the main triggering factor for severe weather development across the entire region for today. And you can see after storms do develop, you can see focusing back towards the Colorado and Wyoming region, back towards that western part of the slight risk region. You can see where we have that 2% tornado threat and where storms originally are. You can see as they begin to track through that 2% tornado threat, you can see them tracking through some strong mid-level flow that is in the upper 30 knots and possibly the low to maybe the mid 40 knots. That's going to allow for the possibility of some strong speed shear and elongated photographs to allow for the possibility of some large hail to develop, as well as a little bit of a possibility of some weak directional shear to develop for the possibility of our 2% tornado threat. You can see that 2% tornado threat is likely going to be isolated to this time in particular, whenever storms are expected to move through parts of eastern Colorado and strong mid-level flow, and then as they enter Kansas and Oklahoma, you can see a very weak mid-level flow ahead of that is not going to allow for the possibility of some directional shear, and not going to allow for the possibility of a continuated tornado threat going into Oklahoma, and it's likely going to keep the tornado threat most likely isolated back towards the Colorado region. And you can see that these storms are expected to develop into more of a squall line than all that much of a cluster of cells, and track across Kansas and Oklahoma, and then across pretty much the entirety of the slight risk region, moving all the way into the Memphis and northern Mississippi region. You can see that is going to be our slight risk region. It's not going to be a bunch of isolated storms that develop from like a stationary boundary or a cold front. It is likely going to be one storm or squall line that moves across the entire region, being supported by intense humidity and moderate instability, and it is likely going to be rapidly organized into an MCS as it moves into Kansas and Oklahoma and continues across Arkansas and Mississippi. Taking a look at our dew points, let's focus on the storms that are expected to move through that slight risk region. I'm not too worried about the more marginal storms back towards the eastern part of the United States that could be, I think, mostly in the marginal range. I'm not too worried about those. Those aren't really going to have all that much of a threat for anything. Their threats are likely going to be possibly a 5% wind threat and probably not all that much of a hail threat. However, there might be a little bit of some small isolated hail, but I am not too worried about those storms. My main concern is going to be those storms that track across the slight risk region. You can see starting off where storms originally develop in southern, southeastern Wyoming. You can see they originally develop in dew points that are likely going to be in the upper 50s to possibly the mid 60s. As storms continue along that slight risk region, they are expected to move through gradually increasing dew points as they continue eastward. You can see by the time they enter Oklahoma, they reach dew points that do reach the mid to low 70s, and then stay in the 70s until they reach Memphis and northern Mississippi, where outflow boundaries are likely going to be triggering severe weather development across the Dixie Valley by tomorrow. This is likely going to be more of an MCS storm, as it can use the intense humidity and possibly more moderate instability depending on our lapse rates, potentially getting up to the low 3000s. However, I think some strong convective inhibition in this region is not going to allow for very strong instability, is likely going to keep it more in the moderate range. But again, as storms track through this slight risk region, they do have the possibility of using the intense humidity that is provided to them to prolong their journey across the slight risk region and likely allow them to have upkeep across the entire region. Taking a look at our lapse rates, you can see across the entire slight risk region, we have some pretty steep lapse rates. You can see the storm line moving through some pretty intense lapse rates with the dew points that are back towards this region at this time. I would assume that Cape values are likely going to be more in the moderates. However, with whatever dew points that we had further out east and across Oklahoma, Arkansas, parts of Missouri, and Memphis region and northern Mississippi, with lapse rates that are in the sixes and sevens, we are likely going to see moderate instability across the entire region with some strong convective inhibition, which is going to again decrease our Cape values a lot, likely keeping them down more in the moderates. We could have gotten up to the 3000s across the slight risk region, more so back in Oklahoma and Arkansas, where we had those stronger dew points, and possibly the weak 3000s back in Colorado, where we have those strong lapse rates and more moderate dew points with strong convective inhibition. Is likely again going to decrease our Cape values a ton and likely going to put our Cape values mostly in the moderate range for the entire slight risk region. Taking a look at our instability, you can see that we do get mostly moderate instability, but further out east, you can see that we do have some Cape values that are reaching the 3000s. However, that is the region where weaker convective inhibition is going to be, so they do have the possibility of getting up to the 3000s regarding lapse rates and the strong humidity that is further out east. However, back further out west, we do have some, again, much stronger convective inhibition, which is going to weaken our Cape values a ton, keeping them again mostly in the moderates. You can see that we do have Cape values that are mostly in the moderates, which is going to be sufficient enough for the possibility of some strong damaging outflow gusts and the possibility of some large hail, depending on our speed shear and elongated hodographs, as well as depending on our directional shear and our storm relative velocity back towards the Colorado region. We could definitely see the possibility of one or two tornadoes, one or two brief tornadoes, as well as again the possibility of some large hail and the possibility of some strong damaging outflow gusts. Taking a look at our wind shear, you can see that we do have some fairly strong wind shear. However, again, like always, I think a lot of this is going to be speed shear with our strong subtropical jet and not associated with any deepening trough. So a lot of this is likely going to be speed shear associated with elongated hodographs. However, there could be some weak directional shear in place in the lower levels, and I will take a look at that in our storm relative velocity. However, I do want to touch on our bulk shear and how it is looking at our bulk shear from 0 to 6 kilometers. So it's looking at pretty much the entire spectrum of shear across the entire atmosphere. So our wind shear is likely going to be highly exaggerated over the entire spectrum and not really all that accurate towards our low levels or our mid levels or our upper levels, and again looking at the entire spectrum. So this is mostly what we have to go off of with our NAM 3 kilometer CONUS models. So this is the best that we get, and it is good when we break it down into the storm relative velocity, but do keep in mind it is a little bit harder to forecast our speed shear depending on our storm relative velocity and our directional shear comparative to our bulk shear, which again looks at the entire atmosphere as well as both the speed shear and our directional shear. So that's why I like to break it down into our storm relative velocity and our bulk shear. But you can see that we do have some fairly strong wind shear across the entire atmosphere. Again, this is likely going to be mostly speed shear, which is going to allow for the possibility of some elongated photographs and the possibility of some large hail. However, again, some low-level directional shear could be possible, and I will take a look at this on our storm relative velocity. Taking a look at our storm relative velocity, you can see right around that 2% tornado threat region, you can see we do have some isolated overall 2% issuing directional shear. It's very isolated, but this directional shear is going to allow for the possibility of that 2% tornado threat, but it is also going to stay mostly in that 2% range, and with overall weak directional shear, I wouldn't expect us to get into that 5% range. Again, it is most likely going to stay in that 2% tornado threat range, again, mostly in eastern Colorado. However, you can see that we do have some fairly strong storm relative velocity and some fairly strong directional shear as the storm line moves into Oklahoma. However, with the lack of diurnal heating overnight, we are likely not going to see all that much of the possibility of tornadoes, as K values are going to rapidly decrease and convective inhibition is going to rapidly increase, leading to the possibility of much weaker instability in this region. But with weak overall instability and some strong directional shear, we could definitely see the possibility of maybe some weak to broad embedded rotation, but definitely not the possibility of any tornadoes overnight in Oklahoma. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. And if you live in any of the areas that I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being, and hopefully I will be able to see you guys tomorrow with a weekly overlook.